Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to give a very brief introduction while we're waiting for further people to join us today. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see so many new faces, but also faces that are familiar to UACES and IACES, so thank you very much. Just as kind of a brief review of what this seminar series is about. This is a joint seminar series between UACES and IACES under the theme of the UK, Ireland and the European Union in a time of crisis. And both organisations felt that this very important but also timely initiative was very important given kind of the relationships between Ireland, the UK and the European Union have been fundamentally reshaped over recent years, in particular because of kind of Brexit. And we really want to focus today on the theme of security and defence in the EU, Ireland and the UK, and really kind of reflect upon some of these common challenges, but also perhaps also emerging opportunities for these three nations to work, and three organisations to work together. So I will pass over to our chair, Professor Richard Whitman, and thank you very much once again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to both IACES and UACES for their foresight in setting up this series on UK, Ireland and the European Union in a time of crisis. And as you'll be aware, our focus today is on security and defence in the EU, Ireland and the UK. The session's being recorded, so you should get a pop-up where you've been asked to give your consent, but if that's a problem, please let us know. The chat is open for your questions, comments, and interventions, so it would be great if you could involve yourselves, because we'd really like to hear from as many people as possible in the time that we have together. We have one of our speakers who'll be joining us in a moment, John O'Brien. And in advance of this, I was thinking, how best to open seminar, how best to capture where we find ourselves. And John tweeted this morning, and I printed out a tweet, which looks very old school. He said, and I quote, "In 1 month, Vladimir Putin has turned Russia into a pariah state, re-energized NATO, kick-started EU defence and security policy, brought the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO closer, turned Ukraine into serious candidate for EU, turned Zelensky into a rock star, catalyzed a 180-degree turn in German defence policy, brought the EU's centre of gravity decisively to the east, heralded a revolution in EU energy policy, triggered an unprecedented implosion in the Russian economy, and turned Russia into a supplicant of China on the world stage." And that's a pretty good encapsulation, I think, of many of the things which have turned the world upside down for people who are interested in European security more generally, but also the context in which the EU, Ireland and the UK now find themselves. And we've got a fantastic panel to help us try and make some sense of where we are. First off, Dr. Maxine David, who's a lecturer in European Studies at Leiden University, and I'm sure you're familiar with her from her work on Russian and EU foreign policy. If you aren't, then I'd really encourage you to take a look at the Routledge Handbook of EU-Russia Relations, which was out just towards the end of last year, I think, which is an absolutely cracking piece of work, and I think probably does as comprehensive a job as we'll ever see. Maxine is co-editor of that, as well as making or having made a number of the contributions to the handbook. Secondly, Professor, now Jocelyn Morsley, I think Professor of European Politics, if that's correct, but Newcastle need to update their website, I think. And Jocelyn, again, will be known to many of you for her work as an editor of the journal European Security, but she's a great expert on Germany and German defense, and I've turned to her when I want insight back. She has a cracking piece in a world-class journal that I think is called the Journal of Common Market Studies, out recently on a European Defence Fund that I'd really encourage you to take a look at if you haven't seen it already. Ben Tonra, who's also joining us, is Professor of International Relations at UCD, University College Dublin. He has worked on European foreign security and defence policy seemingly forever, I think, and he's been absolutely integral to my understanding of the relationship between national foreign policies and European foreign policies. And again, on recent work, if you haven't taken a look at the book that he co-edited on conflict resolution and global justice, the European Union in the global context, then you're missing a treat, because it's a really very, very nice piece of work and lots of insight in there. And lastly, John, who I don't think is with us yet, John O'Brennan, who's Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration and Director of the Mayhew Centre for European and Eurasian Studies. I had to check, there's only one John, because he's written on parliaments and the EU. He's written widely on Ireland and the EU, enlargement, the EU's neighbourhood policy more generally understood. So I'm not quite sure which John we'll get today, but if we get any of that, then we're going to get a lot of insight. So he'll be joining us after he's finished teaching this morning. So by prior agreement with the panelists, we've sort of broken down how we want things to be structured, which is not to say that we want to sort of close down the discussion, but we really want to try and get into some really nitty-gritty topics. And so I tasked each of the panelists to have an opener for 7 minutes, and we're going to hear from Maxine first, then Jocelyn, then Ben, and last to you, John, to give you a chance to catch your breath. So Maxine, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emily and Catherine, for inviting me today, and to IACES and UACES for funding this. And thank you, Richard, for chairing, which I know is always a difficult task. I've been researching EU-Russia relations for a long time, and we've been talking about the declining state of that relationship for a long time as well. We, and by we I mean those of us who work on this relationship, always realized that this was not a relationship to be taken for granted. But we have perhaps taken for granted the fact that the people-to-people contacts would remain, and particularly that scholars in the EU could work with scholars in Russia. As Richard mentioned, the Routledge Handbook of EU-Russia Relations came out last year, but if we were still working on it, I at least would not be able to continue working on it. So I raise this as an illustration of how profound, really, the crisis is, because while political relations in the past have gone through very, very dire times, we have always been able to rely on those people-to-people contacts, and this just is not the case at all anymore. That brings me to just thinking about crisis. Now, there's excellent work talking about how the manner in which we frame something makes a difference as to whether we really are talking about crisis versus, for instance, challenge. When it comes to the war in Ukraine that Russia is prosecuting and what this means for EU-Russia relations, we are indisputably talking about crisis, economically, politically, militarily, and societally. There are clear resource dimensions, and the impact on the Ukrainian economy will have consequences for far beyond Europe, as we're already seeing in respect of grain exports, and particularly to Middle Eastern countries that are already having their own troubles. At the same time, we can narrate the war and this crisis in a variety of ways. And perhaps this is something for us to talk about in the Q&A, thinking about crisis in relation to history, identity, and empire. Because I think that all of these are very important for understanding how war came to Ukraine. But events there have implications for other European societies too. And we should be careful, I think, about assuming that any of us is immune from some of the processes we have seen at work in Russia and Ukraine. One of the reasons that I think I'm rather boring in terms of always talking about the necessity for reflexivity in the EU and in the member states themselves. Not least in relation to crisis, I think it's important to remember that it is human beings that will determine whether to frame this war as a crisis that can be resolved. So that takes us to the search for solutions, if we think that this is a crisis that can be resolved, or whether human beings will frame it as irresolvable, which will suggest the crisis is more long-term and take on quite different dimensions. Aside from this, there are just a few points I would like to make. So one of those is just to flesh out a little bit more about the EU-Russia relations being in steeper decline and the impact on people-to-people contacts. So at all points, really, when Russia's relations with the EU or with individual states have deteriorated, one thing has remained, those people-to-people contacts. So think about the Litvinenko killing, the Skripal poisoning, in the UK, this was the case then as well. There were signs after 2014 and Russia annexing Crimea that investment confidence was reducing. So Vasily Astrov, an economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and one of the contributors to the handbook, talked about Russia enacting a strategic sector law to protect in security terms key industries, also flagging up Russia's unwillingness to adopt EU norms in regulating trade and the effects that that had in terms of dampening foreign investor confidence. In early March this year, it was declared that Dutch knowledge institutions would suspend all arrangements with educational and knowledge institutions in Belarus and Russia, based on an appeal from the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science. Even without such formal suspensions, the inability to transfer monies and almost certainly the impossibility of getting visas effectively means the bridges to people contacts are closed, even broken. And I think that this matters enormously because in the future, we are likely to see hardening Russian attitudes towards the EU and perhaps Europe more generally. There is evidence also that those who are rich enough are already leaving Russia, and certain sectors are being very detrimentally affected. So estimates from the Russian Association for Electronic Communications, for instance, are that 50 to 70,000 IT staff have already left Russia, with predictions for more than double that number to leave in the near future. So this has clear implications for the modernization agenda that the EU tried to pursue with Russia starting back in 2010. The second point I want to make is about the solidarity with which the EU has responded, and actually very quickly. Right, so we have seen this time a fairly clear Russia policy that had been largely missing until 2014 and the sanctions that were imposed and then rolled over ever since. It was said back in 2014 when the EU agreed sanctions, and it has been said even more resoundingly in the past few weeks, that Russia has managed to unify the EU member states in an unprecedented fashion. The same might be said for NATO, but let's see what comes from the ongoing summit. And I think we can certainly expect to see a deepening of exchange and cooperation between the EU and NATO. So I'll be looking for signs of that, perhaps even an extension of institutional structures to improve cooperation. And just to put a little pressure on Ben here, I would definitely like to hear more from him on this, since Ireland is one of the neutrals, will have much to say about this, and the neutrals have always been a place for us to look to. Two more things on solidarity. It's striking, I think, how often we have seen now Estonian, Lithuanian, Finnish and Polish voices being given a platform on mainstream media in Europe. And I wonder whether this is an opportunity for that kind of new-old binary, new member states, old member states to be overcome finally. Certainly what I would hope is that we will listen a lot more to those voices from those states who are a little closer to Russia. But a bit more negatively about solidarity is that I don't think that we should be at all complacent. We see already that Italy and the Netherlands and others do not support Ukraine's membership of the European Union. Public opinion is currently in favor, but as the economics of this crisis and other challenges bite, we should expect that opinion to be fickle or at least mutable, perhaps even open to manipulation. And we're seeing already that Poland is being critical of other member states for not assisting enough with refugees. That's understandable, but also makes Poland liable to accusations of hypocrisy, given to its reaction to the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 and onwards. So I'm happy to see the solidarity so far, but I'm also worried and think that this is something that really has to be nurtured very, very carefully along the way. I think I'm pretty much up at my 7 minutes, but again, I'm happy to take questions about any of the structures of EU-Russia relations. So what this might mean now for ever seeing a replacement for the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which has been long expired essentially anyway, and what this means about the 5 principles and also the pushback, constrain and engage agenda. But I'll leave that here there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. I think there's lots of issues there that I'm sure we want to pick up in the discussion, and thank you for introducing so many elements. And just a reminder that if you want to join in the debate, then if you could put your question or indicate that you want to ask a question into the chat. If it's directed at somebody in particular, so you want to respond to anything that Maxine said, then you could perhaps indicate that in the chat as well. And it would then allow us to have a bit of a backwards and forwards, if that's okay. So Jocelyn, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. And as Maxine's already said, thank you to everybody for organising this. It's a really good opportunity to actually share thoughts on what is a really big moment for security here in Europe, and in fact more globally as well. There is no doubt right now that there are questions being put about the global security order, not just the European security order. I think what I'd like to start with is to pick up on Maxine's last points around solidarity and the European Union response, which I would agree has thus far been pretty good. I would agree with everything Maxine has already said, but I would add a couple of other things that have dawned on me in the past few weeks. And that is that I'm being continually reminded of the 1990s and the Bosnian War in particular. And I think there is a real grave danger that Europe, the European Union, finds itself making promises that it can't live up to. And I think the consequences of that are already very obvious in the Balkans, and I know John will pick up on this. But I think there's a real danger that European politicians make promises to Ukraine that they have no intention of living up to, and that we fall back into the same trap that we fell into collectively in the 1990s that scholars called rhetorical entrapment. And because I think that is actually a really potentially big problem. And certainly I do wonder just how much we can rhetorically rely on all the rhetoric behind so-called Zeitenwende in German foreign and defense policy in particular. And I'll pick up on that in a further round of responses later on. So I think we need to be careful. We need to be careful what we say. We need to be careful what we commit to. And we need not to be shocked into doing things that are unwise. It is undeniable that this crisis has made us think about some questions around European defence that have long been asked and rarely answered, and they are now becoming inescapable. One of those is EU-NATO cooperation. What does each body actually do in terms of provision of security? An inconvenient one is that we probably need to go back and rethink what we all agree on as far as nuclear deterrence is concerned. I think most of us happily tore up our undergraduate notes on disarmament treaties and the like, but remembering how those disarmament treaties were arrived at and the confidence building measures that were built into them, it's probably going to be an area that we're going to need to think about again whenever we come to some sort of resolution to the immediate hot phase of this war, whatever that may look like. Because, like it or not, the mood among some politicians is simply to recreate Cold War Europe. And I'm not entirely convinced that that's a great idea, to put it mildly. In particular, I think there is a discussion that is starting around military expenditure and the need to raise it. I think this is a debate that you need to be very careful about, and you need to think exactly what is meant by military expenditure and where expenditure is actually sensible and where it is less so. If nothing else, Russia's experiences thus far in Ukraine have told us that there are some dangers in assuming military superiority by counting tanks. If you don't maintain them, if they are not deployable, and if you don't take any care of the morale of your armed forces, you have problems. And those are things that are not so easily captured in the CIPRI databases that my fellow defence nerds rely on so much. And I think we all have to potentially think a little bit more carefully, rather than just saying everybody needs to spend 2% on defence. We need to raise defence spending. It's more nuanced, and the debate needs to become more nuanced. And I think we as scholars have a responsibility to ensure that that does take place. And then the final thing that I would say is that we probably need to remember that it's not just going to be about security policy. The knock-on effects of this particular crisis are going to be felt across multiple policy areas. And I think at the moment we probably underestimate just how big those are going to be. Maxine has already mentioned the problem of grain shipments and the potential for major food crises in the developing world. That's one area that needs to be paid quite a lot of urgent attention to. And so I think we need to start thinking more broadly, even now, about where this might go and what sort of policy responses the European Union in particular can offer. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Jocelyn. One of the questions I have for you when we come back to the next round is you touched on sort of Cold War Europe and not a return to Cold War Europe, but there are voices which have started to talk or to use the language of containment, and I wondered if you had a view as to whether that what we understand from Cold War containment in any way has for utility when we think about the relationship with Russia in the future. And for Maxine, sorry, I've been digesting what you had to say because there's a lot in there, and I really wondered if when we get to our next round, whether you think about picking up on the question of what the locus of sort of Russia's strategy is going to be in the future. Has this has this sort of changed the configuration of forces in the EU in terms of who might be driving Russia policy? If you don't mind thinking about that, I thought I'd do it now, then, you know, rather than put you on the spot in a mo, if that's okay. Ben, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks again also to the organisers of the session. I'm going to shift gaze slightly to look at the intersection between what's going on at the European level and what's going on in member states, and obviously focus on the member state that I know best. I think our starting point has to be that, you know, we recognise that this is a full frontal assault from a nuclear armed state on the post-war settlement. Not just the post-Cold War settlement, which I think we all acknowledge Putin is challenging, but actually the post-World War II settlement, because this really is an attack on international law, the UN, and the norms that we've drawn around ourselves to shield us from the worst excesses of international anarchy. Interestingly, in the weeks running up to the invasion, or the second invasion, I was contacted by a couple of small state EU ambassadors here in Dublin, who were asking very politely why they weren't hearing more from the Irish government on what was going on the Ukrainian border and the run-up to the second invasion. Their anxiety was that this for them was such an assault, or potential assault at that time, on international norms and the UN, that they expected to hear more from the Irish on these questions. I think since the invasion, we've seen genuine and full-blooded investment and engagement from the very top of government, including the president, our Taoiseach, and all ministers, all repeatedly declaring that Ireland is not neutral on this question. This is an assault on international norms and the rule of law. We had sort of a subsidiary debate about the provision of lethal aid to Ukraine. And the decision on that not to provide lethal aid to Ukraine was due less to any principled discussion of neutrality and more to internal coalition dynamics, where we have a Green Party in government, and they had already, in our program for government, had instituted a veto on providing any lethal aid through the European Peace Facility. But the crisis has come at a very unique time in a reconsideration of Irish security and defence policy. Ireland suffered a Russian-based cyber attack on its health service last year. We saw the Russian maneuvers in the Irish economic zone, which was allegedly above certain key cable infrastructures. We've seen repeated Russian testing of NATO defences through Irish airspace. And all of that has highlighted over the last number of years what I like to describe as the Blanche Dubois defence policy of the Irish state. That is to say, a reliance on the kindness of strangers to provide for our defence, whether that's implicit through NATO or explicit in agreements with the Royal Air Force in the UK. All of that came to a head back in January with the publication of a National Commission, a paper from the National Commission on Defence, which really for the very first time was taking a very serious look at what Irish defence should look like and what it should provide for. And it was predicated, and I think this is emblematic, it was predicated on an acknowledgement from the Irish Defence Forces that they were not capable of defending the state. So that's the benchmark, that's the baseline from which we start this conversation about what's going on in terms of European security and defence. So in summation, you're looking at sort of an Irish attitude to defence and security, which has been underdeveloped and underdiscussed for a very long time, coming to a certain point of crisis in a national context here in January, and now embedded in this wider European crisis. And it's the wider European crisis which is going to pose some significant challenges to Irish policymakers. There's a fabulous book, if any of you haven't seen it, from a former Irish Perm Rep to the EU, Bobby McDonough, who wrote about the nature of symmetry in the European Union. And one of my favorite lines from that, and I'm paraphrasing, was that things you never hear in EU summits are Rubicons being crossed, heads being knocked together, decisive step forwards, and innovative departures. That really has been turned on its head in the last 4 weeks, because we've seen all of that in terms of European security and defense. We have seen a phenomenal shift in German policy that Sunday morning when Olaf Scholz spoke to the Bundestag. We have seen things now put on the European agenda, which I can't imagine any of us in the room, 6 weeks ago would have thought to be seen visible. I really take Jocelyn's point there in terms of rhetorical overbidding. There is that danger, and there always has been on the European side, to promise more and underdeliver. But I genuinely think the baseline for the European conversation has been profoundly shifted. That places a European common defence front and centre in terms of conversations. A European common defence which may well be forged in very close partnership with NATO, but which will pose significant challenges to states such as Ireland within the European Union, because the choices that we'll have available to us are to veto a European common defence, which I don't see as likely, an opt-out from a European common defence, which would put Ireland at the periphery and margins of European construction, or an opt-in to a European common defence, which will pose a very, very significant and difficult national debate. And I finish on this point. That European common defence is going to have to deal with the issue of nuclear deterrence. There's no way of getting around this. We are phenomenally blessed in the current occupant of the White House. We have in 30 months' time the prospect of a second Trump administration, or perhaps worse still, a US administration which represents a smarter Trump. In other words, one of Trump's acolytes who speak from the same kind of hymn book as Trump does. In that context, a European common defence is going to have to deal with the nuclear deterrence issue. And as we'll all be aware, the French have put this on the agenda sort of voce at times in the past. But if it becomes an issue of Europe genuinely having to stand on its own in 30 months' time, or planning for the prospect of having to stand on its own, then nuclear deterrence is going to have to be part of the conversation. And that, to my mind, is going to be an extraordinarily difficult and indeed existential conversation to be had, not just here in Ireland, but more broadly within the European Union.
Thank you, Ben. So you've dodged all the difficult questions then. It really takes us into very different territory, doesn't it, in terms of what the contours of European security debate have been in the past, EU security debate rather. And I want to, the question I got for you on our next round to add to your comments is, what does it do to the sort of constellation of forces within debates on EU defence and security? You know, we've seen a lot of dramatic things happen, but we used to talk in terms of different sort of constituencies, you know, the sort of transatlanticist type orientation, you know, those are a bit more anxious about the prospects of undermining NATO and so on, and neutrals or post-neutrals. Does it mean that language doesn't help us anymore, really, to think about how states line up? And in our third round, we'll get into the Irish questions a bit more, if that's okay. John, over to you. Welcome. Glad to see that the Irish taxpayer is getting value for money with you teaching and doing this on the same day. Over to you.
And I might add, Richard, with the effects of COVID very much around me. So if you identify a frog in the throat, it's precisely that. Thank you to you, and thank you to Emily and colleagues for organizing this event, and it's great to be part of it. My starting point is in thinking about enlargement policy and neighbourhood policy. And I think Jocelyn was absolutely right to emphasize Frank Schimmelpfennig's rhetorical entrapment as a potential problem. And in thinking about enlargement policy, this looms really large, because we all remember the optimism, I think, after the intervention in Kosovo in 1999. Shortly after that, we had the Thessaloniki summit in 2003. And you may recall that there, the European Union committed to taking into the Union those Western Balkan states that wanted to be part of the Union and that satisfied the criteria. Almost 2 decades on, most of those Western Balkan states are as far away from membership now as they were in 2003. So the entire process has been characterized by stasis. And the big question is, does the Ukraine war fundamentally change the dynamics of enlargement policy? In the immediate sense, of course, it's been about Ukraine potentially jumping into the queue for membership. Now that presents opportunities, but it also presents significant challenges. For example, if Ukraine were to somehow supersede the existing candidates, it potentially opens up fissures both inside some of those candidate or would-be candidate states. I'm thinking of Bosnia and Herzegovina most prominently, and indeed between those states and Ukraine. So whatever solidarity they are offering Ukraine now, and I think it has been an almost complete solidarity with the exception of Serbia for some very obvious reasons, you know, what happens when Ukraine is rewarded for the extraordinary courage and resilience that its people have shown by being inserted into a process that most of these states have been part of, but haven't made progress within over these 2 decades. So I think we can point to a really long-standing problem that goes back at least to the financial crisis. It's the problem of enlargement fatigue within the European Union, mirrored by so-called reform fatigue within the Western Balkan states. The process I described 8 years ago in a piece for the European Foreign Affairs Review as flatlining along a trajectory of frozen negotiation chapters. Well, very, very little has changed in the 8 years since. And it's a great puzzle, I think, as to trying to determine how, or if at all, Ukraine arriving on the scene, as it were, might change that. Within the enlargement process, there are 2 big problems. I think Jocelyn has referred to the hesitancy amongst some member states, the Netherlands and France in particular, some other member states too, even in the kind of atmosphere that's prevailed over the last 4 weeks, there is still rhetorical hesitancy about the idea of Ukraine becoming part of the regatta of prospective member states. Does the Ukraine crisis change these dynamics of stasis? Well, in my view, not necessarily, partly because there's a structural problem within the European Council. It's been a feature of the process that for many years, either individual member states or subsets of the membership have been prepared to intervene to block progress, either in the macro sense of the negotiations in the way that France did 3 years ago, or in the narrower sense where one member state tries to block a candidate state. Think about Bulgaria's objections, for example, to North Macedonia. And North Macedonia had made more progress than any other candidate state, you know, in that immediate period before that happened. It had actually changed the name of the country, in fact, and it was met with nothing but objections from France, Bulgaria, and from some other member states. Now, the member states will point to what's been going on in the candidate states, and rightly they will point to these patterns of state capture and rent-seeking by privileged elites as the most important impediment to progress. But in a way, I would argue one thing feeds off the other. The hesitancy of the member states and the attempts at obstruction has its concomitant in the elites in candidate states and would-be candidate states saying, well, what's the point of engaging in any of the reforms the European Union wants when we are no closer to membership now and we're not in any way guaranteed to move along in the process, even if we do the sometimes very costly reforms that the European Union asks for. One other big problem, I think, is on the European Union side, and it is with the appointment of Oliver Varhelyi, Viktor Orban's man in Brussels previously, to the enlargement and neighborhood portfolio. I think this has been a disastrous error. I think the Hungarians made it very clear that what they wanted was states like Hungary and Poland sitting alongside them in the European Council. And you can see this playing out within enlargement policy in multiple different ways. So one of the things I think that has got to happen is that the enlargement portfolio has got to be taken away from Hungary. And we may well see a change in Hungary after the election on the 3rd of April. I still suspect that that's not going to happen, that Fidesz will remain in office. But I think the case for removing the Hungarian commissioner is as strong as it could possibly be. And I can't ever recall an enlargement commissioner attracting the kind of opprobrium that he has in the short period that he has been in office. And isn't it deeply hypocritical for the European Union to be taking the side of the Democrats in Ukraine while actually failing to stand up to the people who've been thrashing the rule of law? And there's a sort of symmetry here inside and outside the EU, because the salami slicing of the rule of law hasn't been limited to Hungary and Poland. It's also very evident in Serbia and in other states in the Western Balkan states. So I think we have to entirely revisit and reconstitute and re-energize the enlargement policy as a matter of priority. And I would hope that if the Ukraine war does anything, it gives impetus to that effort. A final point about neighborhood policy and about the Eastern Partnership. In a way, one could argue that the Eastern Partnership grew out of enlargement policy. Many of the management sort of modalities and so forth really came out of the earlier successful template for expanding the EU, even if with the obvious limitations attached to membership. Well, all that has changed dramatically. And one could argue that not only is there a very strong case for Ukraine becoming fast-tracked for membership, I would say the same about Moldova. Moldova has been doing extraordinary things in hosting more than 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Its government is clearly a pro-European, one of the most pro-European that Moldova has had. So one of the consequences of this might well be that a good part of the Eastern Partnership is actually folded into enlargement policy in the months and years ahead. Finally, on Ukraine itself, its membership is far from assured. However, you could argue that EU membership is a much more tangible or realizable objective than is NATO membership. I mean, President Zelensky has more or less said as such. And there's a good case for suggesting that Ukraine already is part of the enlargement model, because if you look, for example, at the things that Ukraine was required to do as part of the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, and let's recall the Maidan protests were as much about the European Union and Ukraine wanting to be part of Europe as anything else, that Ukraine arguably has been asked to do more than a candidate state like Serbia in respect of economic integration, and is more advanced in its integration in some respects than Serbia and other states in the Western Balkans. So this isn't as much of a stretch as people might imagine, I would say. And this is reflected in the change in trade patterns similarly since 2014. I leave it there, Richard. Lots to talk about in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Again, for the next round, I wondered whether I could ask something that sort of picks off where you left off, which is, what does this do to the thinking about neighbourhood policy at large, and in particular the different categories that the EU has set up, and the apparent difficulty to sort of flex between them. So you could say it's ended up the worst of all possible worlds in terms of serving the EU's interests, and whether you want to have a little bit of a think on that. As with all of my observations, please feel free to ignore them they're not particularly helpful. What I want to do now, if it's okay, is to focus a little bit more on the EU and other responses that have already been picked up in our discussion in the first round, or the interventions in the first round, and invite everybody to come back in again, a bit more quick fire this time, so not so long. But I'd also like to draw everybody's attention to the question that Heidi Maurer asks in the chat, which is an essay length question, I think, but a great question in terms of, as I read it, what the EU's learned from the past and how that impinges on the way that the EU is able to respond now, and also the degree to which the EU has moved along, and what the limits of that moving along are in terms of some member states. So we'll have a look at the EU and NATO next, and then we'll get into more detail on the UK and Ireland into a third round, if that's okay. So, Maxime, back to you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so Richard's question about where we should look in the EU for the locus of action towards Russia. This is going to depend entirely on what the EU ultimately decides it needs to protect and who it decides is necessary to achieve that. I completely agree with Ben and also what Jocelyn has said about the nuclear aspect, so definitely France. It's the only remaining nuclear state in the EU, and we also know that France has always had a strong stance on Russia, whether more pro or less pro, but it wears its position loudly, if you like. All eyes are naturally going to be on Germany, because it's been Germany's economic interest that people have rightly focused on. It's been most exposed. And of course, that this huge shift in its foreign policy, what will actually happen to that. Now, whether or not Germany will really want to take a lead on this, I think, is another matter, but it is obviously also exposed to the Chinese economy. And since the Chinese are important, at least in the short term, to trying to get Putin to see sense, for want of a better way of thinking about it, Germany might have some leverage there. But I think that the neighborhood is really important. I completely agree about Moldova, but also Georgia. While we've got a Georgian leadership that is being fairly unhelpful at the moment, we know that there is very strong support among the Georgian people for Ukraine, and of course they're very, very worried. So I would hope and expect the Baltics to come into play, and I would like to hear more from Finland as well in terms of the neighborhood. Poland, I think, is a tricky one. It certainly earned a seat at the top table again, right? Just with what it's doing with refugees, but also because it is a big country. It has an awful lot of knowledge of Russia and history of Russia. But those rule of law issues remain. Von der Leyen may have put this onto the back burner until after the Hungarian elections. But I hope that they come back, because it's not going to do the EU any good whatsoever if it is seen to let rule of law issues in Poland and Hungary go, because this just plays into many of the narratives from the Kremlin. And I just wanted to say, generally, what I am hearing about the development of the EU in defence and security terms means that I have real concerns about its normative power, reputation, and its willingness to kind of hold on to that reputation. What I think won't happen, but I wish would happen, is that Western European states understand that this West planing that we have seen is really, really unhelpful. It is what has denied Ukraine agency in its own future, and to kind of deny this as well to Central and Eastern European member states, I think is really, really problematic. So I think it was Chirac that once said to Poland that this was a very, very good opportunity for it to shut up. And I would turn that back on quite a few of the Western European member states as well.
Thanks, Maxine. There's Paul raises the interesting question in the chat about negotiated end to the war on Ukraine, but expresses this in terms of, if you like, talking to Russia if Russia can't be trusted. And as far as I can see, you know, there are different expressions of the degree to which one can talk to Russia. You know, we've got on the one hand, you know, the French president engaging in ongoing conversations with Mr. Putin, even if those are not having any effect. And let's say at the other end, you know, some member states clearly are not interested in any kind of dialogue with Russia. But at some point, there's going to be a process to manage the end of the conflict, and trust seems to be, you know, pretty important to that kind of a process. Do you think this is an issue that is going to divide member states? You know, the extent to which it's possible to trust, if I could put it in those terms. I know that's not Paul's question, but if Paul excuses me, I want to use it for that purpose.
Yeah, there is every reason not to trust Russia at the moment under Putin. You know, there's just no good reason whatsoever to trust, and I'm not sure, to be honest, that there was that much trust in Brussels, at least. And I think that we also have to be very careful about what we hear, of course, from leaders as well, because they will say what needs to be said in diplomatic terms, and what they think more privately, I think, is very, very different. But I'm not sure that anybody has really trusted Russia for a very long time. In terms of this kind of negotiated end, you can't. But we knew this from Syria as well. So look at, you know, the attempt for the humanitarian corridors. This is exactly what we saw in Syria. I'm sorry to say, we apparently just stopped caring about Syria very much. And now Ukraine is paying the price. What I think that there, yeah, I do have concerns. I think there will be divisions. And I think there are still those in the European Union who think that if we just can leave Russia to Ukraine, then we'll all be okay. We won't. And then there are those who are making the point, and they are right, that the more weakness Putin sees, the more that he will reach for. And I think that all of the evidence is right on that, and has been for a long time. We've just not been listening to it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Jocelyn, coming to you, I wonder whether you also wouldn't mind picking up on Heidi's last point about stronger European defence and really the relationship between EU defence and NATO, and whether there's anything you feel you want to say on how you think that might work itself out. I mean, you know, we've got, you know, the interesting juxtaposition of European Council and NAC at the level of heads of government and state in Brussels on the same day, which is pretty extraordinary. But are they still two sort of competing models? Are they, can you see that they'd be complementary?
I think it's a really interesting question. And of course, the EU published the Strategic Compass this week, which is meant to be the master plan for EU defence going forward. I have some sympathy with Hilke Dijkstra's immediate judgment on Twitter, which was, what's new in this? You can make that criticism. Okay, there's the headline 5,000 strong intervention force, but as per general practice, it's really what we might have needed to withdraw from Afghanistan successfully. It's always planning for the previous failed intervention, if you see what I mean. And I think that's an ongoing problem, and quite why you would publish a hastily updated strategic compass document just because you'd said you'd publish it this week, when it really needs a lot more thinking about and revising, I don't really get. So I'm a little bit pessimistic that the EU really intends to strengthen defence. The interesting bit in the strategic compass package is probably the new financing modalities that have been suggested, particularly around VAT. But again, I think there's a real danger here, and this is partly because of the way that the European Commission has come to frame defence through its permissible avenues of technology and industrial policy. That the EU is starting to assume that the interests of defence firms and the interests of the armed forces are identical. They are not. And there needs to be considerable more nuance in how that conflict, in fact, is thought about. And in particular here, I think there's some dangers to the strategic autonomy rhetoric, because I don't think people have really thought through what that would mean in practice. And that here brings me to the how does the EU connect to NATO question. And I don't think it's obvious, because the way in which the two organisations are going to have to function for the foreseeable future, as Maxine has said, there is no trust with Russia. There will not be for some time. And while I am not convinced that containment, as Richard asked me to think about, can really work again, I think there's considerable danger in trying to contain Russia and sort of, I mean, okay, so best case scenario, you manage somehow to get Russia out of most or all of Ukraine. But at what stage do you stop a wounded Russia turning to China? Is that necessarily in the EU's best interest? I don't think it is. So there's a real dilemma about what's going forward is the best thing to do. And I think in some ways, NATO was meant to be announcing a new strategic concept this June. If that has a delay and a chance to rethink, I think there are avenues that it might be worth reinvestigating. And I wonder in particular whether, particularly because I take the point that somebody made earlier, what if a Trump Mark II is elected in the United States? Europe collectively does need a plan B, and whether there is some mileage in rediscovering ESDI from whenever we last dumped that as a concept, but a specific way of linking EU and NATO efforts among a European plank. Now, obviously, Brexit in the UK is a big problem in all of that, but I wonder whether some of those discussions potentially could be reopened and whether that might be a way forward, but difficult, to put it mildly, not least because the membership of the two institutions is not identical. And in that, there is a problem.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And, you know, there's, I mean, it's the hard yards now, isn't it? I mean, on having sort of agreed the strategic compass or the text of the strategic compass. I mean, that's the easy bit, isn't it? You know, a bit like the global strategy, nothing was going to get in the way of its publication, even a member state voting to leave. So there is, but you could see that on the one hand, that's a sort of positive momentum, isn't it? But on the other hand, it does seem to be rather, a pause would have been better, maybe. Anyway, I want to bring Ben in now. Sorry, you may be able to hear dogs in the background. Somebody's unleashed the dogs of war, or certainly some very cross dogs. Anyway, Ben, there's a question for you in the chat. It's either from Helen or Helene. I'm sorry, I can't tell from from the name attached to the question, which is whether you could elaborate a bit more on how you see the imperative to deal with nuclear deterrence. And I wonder if I could also add in one of Heidi's questions, which I think is a really, really interesting question, which is the degree to which European societies, politicians are willing to pay a higher price for the defence of their values and interests. I mean, that I think is really interesting in the context of Ireland, but you can pick up the Ireland point in the next round if you like. But I think that also chimes perhaps with some of the work that you've done in the recent past as well. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I was going to link Helena's question with your initial question on the, is talking about Atlanticists and Gaullists, is that still relevant in talking about European security defense? And I think it is, but I think the baseline, as I say again, has profoundly shifted. I think we do face, and this also reflects a little bit on Maxine's point, we owe an apology to our colleagues in the Baltic states and Poland and elsewhere for not listening for a very long time in terms of what they were telling us Russia was like, Russia could be. And that sense of us particularly robbing Central and Eastern European states of their agency, I think is a legacy we should remember and bear in mind. But what I'm talking about in terms of why I think nuclear deterrence is going to be, at least, if not at the heart, then close to the center of our conversations on a common defense, is the following. That debate between Atlanticists and Europeanists was very much predicated on NATO offered the most credible territorial defense because of the link to the United States and the nuclear guarantee. With the nuclear guarantee, at least in question, post the next election, and it was in question prior to the last US election, I think, as Jocelyn says, there has to be a plan B. There has to be consideration of what a European defense would look like in the absence of a coherent and strong US backup through NATO. So that puts, I think, deterrence on the table in terms of a strategy. It's also on the table because the French are putting it on the table, and they have repeatedly sort of put it out there as something to be thought of. But it does pose a real challenge to then encompass a common defense that is inclusive of all EU member states, because obviously the Irish and the Austrians in particular will have an issue with nuclear deterrence because they support a UN treaty that calls the use of nuclear weapons to be contrary to international law and illegal. So how do you subscribe to a common defense which is even, at least in part, predicated on a nuclear deterrence? And how credible would an EU common defense be without a territorial guarantee? And how credible is a territorial guarantee of defense without nuclear deterrence? You see what I'm saying? There's like a cascading waterfall of implications and conversations that have to be had. And I'm sorry, Richard, I missed I've forgotten the last bit of your redirect. I think it was, sorry, it's coming back to me now. This was Heidi's question on what Europeans are willing to pay. Folks, I'm old enough to remember the 60,000 strong European Rapid Reaction Force of Helsinki in 1999. So we know the gaps between what is promised and what is delivered. But I think the profound difference is, and I come back to the point, that what we have seen in terms of Russia and Ukraine is so extraordinary, so egregious, so challenging to the basic ways that we thought the world worked, that I think, as I say, the baseline of that European conversation has shifted. And I think there will be a profound willingness on the part of European states to undertake the kinds of costs necessary to provide ourselves with the kind of common defense that we think we need. But what the nature of that common defense is going to be the tricky bit.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, John. Paul is also, as well as being in agreement with you on EU needing to be consistent in its support for democracy. He's also suggested that there needs to be some means that needs to be found to force Poland and Hungary into line on that issue. I mean, it's taking that more broadly. I mean, is this not also one of the problems that the EU has had or has in its sort of neighbourhood policy? Is a decrease in credibility when it comes to the requirements it makes of third countries to comply with EU norms, when those outside sort of take a look inside the EU and think, well, hang on, some states are struggling on the Copenhagen criteria, which we thought were pretty integral to even getting your sort of toe in the door for the prospect as being a member state.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. In some ways, the rule of law crisis was a hidden crisis, in part because of the relative comfort that I think some member states exhibited with the evident decline in the rule of law in Pungry-Hole and elsewhere. But this isn't inevitable, and where I think a decade ago, when Orban was beginning to salami slice the different sort of institutions of pluralism in Hungary, the response from the Commission very often was, we don't have the toolbox to be able to adequately handle this. I don't think we can say that anymore, but the problem for me has always been one of political will, the lack of political will in the Council and in the Commission to tackle these transgressions. And it's taken the activism of many EU law specialists and people in the European Parliament, as well as civic society in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, to really force the Commission to take this stuff seriously. It's required cases being taken to the Court of Justice similarly, but I think there's been a significant fight back, partly because there has been such an extraordinary series of cases coming from the court, and where the judgments have been so definitive in saying Poland and Hungary and other states do not have the right to depart from everything that's been codified in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. I also draw your attention to an episode from last week where the European Public Prosecutor, Laura Kodruta-Kövesi, went to Sofia and was president, perhaps coincidentally, but while the former Bulgarian Prime Minister Boyko Borisov was arrested. Now, I think this is potentially very significant. There are 120 different cases that her office has opened up in relation to Bulgaria. And I think her presence, although of course Hungary amongst some states hasn't yet signed up to the EPPPO, but I think her activism, and remember, she was somebody who put the fear of God into corrupt politicians when she had held office in Romania. We are beginning to see a significant rebalancing of the pendulum in favor of the rule of law. Certainly what happens in Hungary on the 3rd of April is very important. Certainly also it has been disturbing to see Ursula von der Leyen's apparent willingness to drop the rule of law conditionality in respect of next generation EU subvention to Poland and on Hungary. To me, that'll be a clear indication about where we stand. The problem might be resolved for the EU by the election result, but I doubt it. And I really hope that we can separate out the Poland that has taken such extraordinary moral leadership in a way on Ukraine from the consistently transgressive Poland in respect of rule of law. We will not have a consistent external policy until we properly tackle these transgressions within the European Union.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, John. What I want to do now is to move us to look a little bit more at the UK and Ireland, and also to think about not just what the response of those states have been, but also what the implications of Ukraine have been, and particularly the place of those states in the debate about Europe's security architecture. So that's in line with Nick Wright's question. He's been very patiently sitting there, and he says, in the light of the big imminent strategic conversations that need to take place about Europe's security architecture, especially on common European defence, is the panel, so whoever on the panel wants to pick up on this on their remarks, optimistic about the role that the UK could play in these debates. And Darren's also made the point, and many of you may have seen this clip of film of Boris Johnson at the NAC today, where he looks a very isolated figure, looks a disgracefully scruffy figure, I have to say. Is the UK isolated? I mean, is that in some way a characterization of where the UK is at the moment? And to what extent is the UK let's say a player now, but also possibly a player in the future? So quite a lot to think about there, or to reflect on, I think, in terms of where we see the UK and Ireland, the way that they're reacting in different ways to the war on Ukraine, but also perhaps stretching yourselves a little bit to think about where that might take us in the sort of future debates about the future of European security. And Samuel has a question, I think, that's for Ben, if you don't mind tackling this as well in your response, Ben, about reconciling neutrality, Ireland's neutrality, with its desire to be part of the European or EU mainstream. So this will be our sort of last substantive round, if that's okay. Each of you can tackle the UK, you can tackle Ireland, or you can tackle this question of the European security order if you feel more comfortable to do so. So Maxine, over to you first.
Okay, thanks very much. Just quickly on the UK, I think we have to be really careful not to see things that we want to see rather than are actually there. So I was also watching this, and actually what I really saw in terms of isolation was how often the women leaders were standing with not many people talking to them, right? Much more than Johnson. And actually, I think people did go up to him. So I didn't see him as particularly isolated, although I also agree on the scruffing, and I would have put him into the back row, but that's just me. In terms of optimism about the role of the UK here, no, I'm really not, because I've actually just finished co-authoring a small piece with Natasha Kurt about this. And the reason that I'm not is because even when there is scope for the UK to play a good and effective role, too often you have the ministers and the Prime Minister, including the Prime Minister, coming back and then undoing any good work with, quite frankly, fairly revolting statements that suggest that they are much, much more concerned about their own interests rather than the British, European, or even global security interests. So with every bit of good that is done, I think that they undo it when they come back and talk in the domestic environment. And it's almost as if they think that people don't pay attention to what is actually happening here. I also think that, again, we're seeing this kind of very typical thing from this government, which is, yes, there's a lot of money. And the military-industrial complex is obviously important for the UK, and so they play to this. But again, you know, if we're talking about values, and we definitely are, because Putin is always talking about values as much as hard security, then the EU and the UK need to be very, very careful to walk their talk, and the UK doesn't. So I think fine for hard power, soft power, absolutely not. I should also say as well that very clearly, I think that we all know that the FCDO has a morale problem, right? If the Russian military has a morale problem, so does the FCDO. And, you know, my impression is that you have got some good analysts at the FCDO who know Russia, but I don't think that they have been particularly well listened to over the years. And then they have also been kind of undermined in official statements as well. I also just wanted to say very, very quickly that when I say about, you know, the West kind of shutting up for a while and letting Central and Eastern Europeans talk so that we should listen to the Balts and the Poles, etc. This doesn't mean that I think that they are always right about everything. I would reject those, right? So there are some voices that are talking about Russia, you know, Russia as if 'twas ever thus and 'twill ever be like this. And I don't think that that can be right. And I don't think that that is the stance that the EU can really take when you've got Germany as a member. If Germany can change, then Russia can change. But I think that we have not been terribly good about really kind of understanding about how you can bring about change in Russia. And this is why I'm saying that these people-to-people contacts and breaking them is just kind of stirring up years and years of grief for us. We need to understand what is being done to in Russia, but also in our own societies, to tell untruthful histories, frankly untruthful histories. And we need to understand when we are blaming ordinary Russians for going out on the street about the impact of years and years of repression in terms of education, also media. We also need to understand that as much as we don't speak Russian, many Russians don't speak English, although that is changing with the younger generation as well. So yes, let's listen, but let's also kind of understand that, Russia might be capable of change, but not, I think, as long as Putin is in office. And I think I've answered everything. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maxine. And I sort of feel as if we need more of a conversation about Russia's future rather than just hoping for Russia's future. Presumably we'd all like a future for Russia after this war, which is more Bonn Republic than Weimar. But how do we get from where we are now to there, and what's the role for outsiders in that? Understandably, we're focused on Ukraine, but it is the major order challenge for Europeans, isn't it? Where Russia fits into Europe and Europe's security order. But thank you very much for your comments. Just before I come to Jocelyn, John and Ben, there's 3 more questions which have popped up for you. That it would be great if you could tackle one from Nick Wright, another one from Paul. Paul, I mean, you, in terms of your productivity, Ireland clearly is still a tiger economy when it comes to question answering. And from Helena, so I think it's Helena, I misidentified you earlier. A pointed question for Ben there, if that's okay. And another one from Derek as well. So if you're willing to have a scan over those while Jocelyn is making her remarks, that would be great, and tackle as many of those as you feel able to do so. So Jocelyn, over to you.
I think the UK has done a couple of useful things. I think the provision of training to the Ukrainian armed forces before the conflict started is probably proven to be far-sighted. So I don't think it's an entirely negative role. Where I think the UK is failing dramatically is in understanding the visibility of its internal politics on the international stage and the damage that that is doing in the shape of Truss, in the shape of Johnson, etc., etc. And bluntly, I can quite understand why Johnson wasn't invited to the EU summit this afternoon. Why would you? He's insulting. He is potentially compromised. Why? So in some ways, I think that, yes, to have a viable European security infrastructure, the UK is going to have to be on board somewhere. But I can quite understand if people would prefer not to do it with the government that is currently in place. And I think that's quite a hard lesson. The rhetoric around global Britain rings very hollowy these days. But I actually think the bigger problem is Germany. And here I'm becoming increasingly skeptical about the big 180-degree U-turn that Scholz has allegedly done. The Sondervermögen, the special funds that he's announced for now certainly solve the problem of meeting the 2% NATO target in this financial year. What I'm not clear about is where it's going to come from moving forward. much of the money that has been promised will bluntly be needed, not just on the high visibility procurement projects that have been announced in the last couple of days and weeks, but also just on sorting out the huge backlog of problems with the German armed forces that are even down to having, what was it, 1 day's supply of ammunition? I don't think the Anglophone media has quite picked up how bad things have got for the Bundeswehr. And so I think caution needs to be paid here. Similarly, going forward, given the German constitutional requirement to run balanced budgets, it is not clear to me, particularly given the very high cost of energy policy changes that are going to have to be made, where Germany will actually find the money. You can't keep having special funds. There is a limit to that as a budgetary device. And in some ways, that I think is going to be a very difficult conversation for German politicians to have. And similarly, I would be slightly concerned about how long Germany is willing to pursue such hard and high-level sanctions. I think sometimes we forget how quasi-corporatist German society can be. And while politicians on the whole are talking the talk and walking the walk on sanctions, I'm less convinced by the German business elite. And I think sometimes we forget how deeply entwined in German politics they actually are. So I think actually keeping Germany on board and committed in terms of major defence and security reimaginings is going to be quite challenging. And I imagine that's already at the forefront of French thinking. But I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jocelyn. You know, there are lots of interesting questions, I think, about, you know, the bilateral, unilateral relationships and how they might be impacted by Germany's defence spend. I mean, you know, one of the things that comes to my mind is, you know, one of the UK messages about being the big defence spender in Europe may not hold. Now, I mean, I take all of your points about, you know, how Germany might make that spend, but it's quite important to the UK to be able to continue to say that. And if Germany really lets rip on defence expenditure, that's going to change things rather significantly again. But topic for another session, I think. So Ben, over to you, Ben, and then to John, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it pretty brief, but lots and lots of questions on Ireland neutrality and where that leaves us. I mean, the first thing obviously to bear in mind is Irish neutrality is incredibly malleable. It has been stretched and adapted in multiple situations and contexts over a long period of time. For some people, it's about pacifism. For some people, it's about simply not taking a view and always being neutral on all questions. For some people, it's just not about being part of a military alliance. That's the government's definition. And for others, neutrality is suffused with a whole range of values about justice, about development, about human rights, about, you know, being on the side of the little person as opposed to the big guys, etc. So there's a lot of scope for malleability. But I think with the conversation surrounding a common defense, things get very hard very fast and choices have to be made. Helena makes the point that, you know, Denmark is revisiting its opt-out on CSDP. I think that illustrates the scale of Ireland's problem or challenge. And that is to say, once a common defense is put on the table to be discussed and or to be agreed, then a choice has to be made whether you participate or not. And in that choice to participate or not, there are costs and consequences, whichever choice is made. I think for the Irish state, where it is today, post-Brexit, etc., I think the balance of argument of participation, engagement, and staying at the heart of European construction is going to be very, very persuasive. But I would not, under any circumstances, underestimate, you know, the powerful counterforces which will argue that for Ireland to engage in a common defense and militarism and European armies and potential nuclear deterrence, that will really strike many people in Ireland hard in terms of that national debate. So I don't know which way that debate will go, but it is going to be an extraordinarily tough one.
Thanks very much, Ben. Before I come to John, I mean, can I just draw your attention to the points that are made by Heidi and by Maxine in the chat? I mean, we're not going to have a chance to get stuck into those because time is against us, but I think that they are incredibly important. I think Heidi's point about, you know, where we listen, how we listen, and what we take away from listening, I think is really important. As well as, you know, we've mentioned the issue, of course, of those who have been forcibly displaced in passing, but we haven't really explored that issue in depth. And Maxine's point about, you know, us as the academy and the way that we've tended to operate in the inadequacy of that in terms of where we find ourselves now and where we might want to do, I think is really very, very important, something for us to reflect on when we think about how we spend our time at the upcoming conferences, ISA, USA, UACES and all that, as well as the more let's say sort of cross-generational points, I think, in terms of how we relate to ECRs and PhDs and so on. So yeah, if you take a look at those as well. But John, over to you.
Just two comments briefly, Richard, to develop what Ben said. This is the first time in my adult life that I think I've begun to witness a non-caricatured conversation about our neutrality, the nature of it and how it might evolve. Where it's been folded into referendum campaigns on Europe in the past, it was entirely caricatured. It was the, you know, EU army, body bags coming back and so forth. As somebody who is Irish, who's actually spent a lot of the last 25 years in Central and Eastern Europe, I didn't need to be persuaded of the case or the existential threat that Russia represented. I've always been in favor of NATO membership for Ireland. I think I'm very much in a minority in that sense, but nothing that has happened recently has changed my mind about that. In fact, it's reinforced a lot of that feeling that I have. But I do wonder about the human element of this, because in contrast to, for example, the Nice Treaty referendums in 01, 02, we have seen huge numbers of people from the Baltic states and Poland come to make their homes and lives in Ireland. This is being replicated now with the number of Ukrainian people. We've already had, I think, around 12,000 people who've arrived in recent weeks. They're going to form an important part of the population in the years to come. So I think the debate that we're going to have on neutrality, which has already begun, will be of a different kind than any that we've had in the past, because these people are really well integrated in their communities, whether it's within schools, universities, and within community structures. And I think it's very difficult actually for Irish people to turn around to their Estonian neighbours and say, well, we appreciated your help on Brexit, but sorry, there's a limit to what we're prepared to offer you if you face the real existential threat of a Russian invasion. So I'm really glad this conversation has begun, and I hope that it ends with Ireland taking, whatever the form it may be, a more responsible position, stepping up and meeting our obligations.
Thank you very much, John, and I really want to thank all of you. I mean, you know, I know we often say that, you know, we have fantastic conversations online and so on, but this is, for me, I think, been unusually insightful. I think both in terms of the substantive points that people have been willing to make, but also the way that you've interacted with the comments from each other, and also, you know, thought about what kind of future we might be facing. So absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much to Maxine. Thank you very much to Jocelyn and to Ben and to John, and also for all of the questions or comments in the chat, which were absolutely great, and I think forced us to think harder. Thank you again to our sponsors, IACES and UACES, and thank you very much to the team in the background for making this happen. So to Emily and other UACES colleagues, I can't see everybody on the screen now, and I'm sure there's somebody I'll forget, but we thank you for all of your work.